Well, good afternoon, everyone. We're in the home stretch of this symposium, and I'm going to be introducing the moderator of this particular panel, which is dealing with technical standards. A very topical event occurred today in California. The members of the panel up here are members of SC228, which is the integration of UAS into the NAS, and in 2016 and 2017 they introduced the world's first three standards that dealt with that topic that were being referenced by an ANSP. The FAA references DO 362, DO 365, and DO 366, which is the command and control, the detect and avoid, and the air-to-air radar minimum operating performance standards. And today we learned that the National Aeronautics and Space Administration has flown their Icana vehicle without an escort using the technology that's specified in those documents. So it was the first example of an unmanned aircraft flying using the detect and avoid technology that this particular special committee had worked on to develop the MOPS for. And I think that's pretty exciting. They had originally planned to fly it in March, I think it was, but they had spectrum issues, and so they had to delay it. But I know that NASA is very proud of the work that they've done, and are very active members of Special Committee 228, and we're very happy to have them there. But right now what I'd like to do is not waste any more time and introduce Brandon Suarez, who is Technical Director at General Atomics, and he will lead the discussion on the technical performance standards. Brandon.
Thank you, Al. And yeah, we were hoping to basically one-up the previous panel from the National Academy to illustrate how fast-paced UAS are, and announce even later breaking news about the flight today. We may have a screenshot. I was trying to work with the AV guys in the back. If you could go to the website that I showed you. Yes, this is actually a screenshot of the flight path that Icana took today. So it actually went up through controlled airspace without a chase plane, using a detect and avoid system. Actually did a low approach over Victorville Airport and landed, all while talking to air traffic control, talking to other aircraft in the airspace, and actually detected an aircraft whose transponder was inoperative, and was able to, the remote pilot of Icana was able to talk to air traffic and call the traffic in sight. Using an air-to-air radar that we had developed and that we've specified as part of DO 366. So definitely a historic day for large unmanned aircraft, and we're excited to sort of announce that here for the first time. And there'll be press releases and all that stuff in all the trade publications in the next couple of days. So with that, I'd like to introduce the panel for this afternoon. Thank you all for sticking it out here with us. I was thinking to myself that I was going to introduce these guys, and then I realized they don't actually need any introduction at all. Well, A, because they're old. I told them I'd have to do something. I got to dig them somehow. Yeah, and B, because they've been around this community for a very long time and are all very accomplished and very integral to the work that RTCA does, and that the UAS community has been doing for the last 10 or 15 years. So Rick Heinrich from Rockwell Collins, Paul McDuffie from Boeing Horizon X, and Mr. Steve Van Treese from the FAA. So thank you all for being here. Since we were laughing, we have a clicking clock in front of us, so we'll go ahead and get right to the questions. I do want to emphasize that please email in questions. I've got a list of things that'll keep us busy, but we definitely want to hear from the audience. So if any questions come in, I think Andy might have went away, but if any questions come in, either raise your hand or we'll get them here on the computer, and we'll break whatever I was asking to get to your questions. So I guess for those in the room that aren't familiar, maybe, well, Paul, you've been the co-chair of SC228 from the very beginning. So can you just describe the scope of the Phase 1 MOPS that were published last year? And the question I want to ask is, how was that scope actually devised? How did we come up with that scope originally?
Yeah, thanks Thanks, Brennan. But being old, I think I've already forgotten what I'm going to say. So that's it. So how y'all do? No. Anyway, we. For those of you who have been involved with 228, you may recall that this effort is really broken into two very distinct phases. We actually began this journey, I think it's going on close to 6 years ago now, with the phase 1 effort. The actual scope or terms of reference for the early or phase 1 portion of the 228 activity was kind of developed collaboratively by a team of experts, FAA obviously being a major driver, a number of industry participants through the RTCA Program Management Committee, ultimately came up with a term of reference, which was I'll say it was an improvement over some of the past efforts that RTCA did with previously SC203. Some of you may remember that process. It was felt that the scope of 203 was way too broad. We use the term boil the ocean. You basically go out there and figure out standards for everything that you need to figure out in order to get unmanned systems into the national airspace routinely. That was more or less doomed to fail. Not to say that the effort of 203 was a waste. There were some valuable documents that came out of that. But in terms of actually delivering operational performance standards, it was felt that the scoping had to be reduced significantly. So the wisdom of that early group who devised the term of reference for 228 really looked at two of the biggest technical challenges associated with UAS integration. The kinds of things that keep you up at night, detect and avoid being one, and command and control being the other. Divided, as I say, looking at those questions in two distinct phases. Our phase 1 effort was looking at primarily larger platforms, more with a military application, that were transitioning from the surface, either through special use airspace or with a chase plane, to the base of Class A airspace, where they became essentially under positive control. So that generally was associated with the larger platforms like the Icana that you saw. That seemed to be the logical first step in developing the MOPS. Phase 2, on the other hand, is primarily everything else. Getting down into sustained operations in the other classes, lower classes of airspace, by other vehicles, other vehicle platforms that are, generally not capable of routine operations up in Class A airspace, which is really kind of this is really foundational for us. And quite honestly, a much bigger technical challenge to look at the DAA and C2 requirements for smaller platforms operating routinely in Class E airspace or other lower levels of airspace is not trivial. It's it's a significant task. But the group has done well. I can't say enough about the work that was done in phase 1 and the quality of those documents and the team that did all the heavy lifting to produce that. And that same group, without flinching, has dove into the phase 2 work. And I can assure you that the same quality of work that came out of phase 1 will clearly come out of the phase 2 effort by the end of 2020. So that's kind of the foundation of where we were.
Great, thank you. You want to?
Yeah, just to build on that a little bit, again, we were trying to expedite the process. So one of the challenges we were given was to use two key pieces as reference. The one was the AFRL work that had been done in detect and avoid, and the other was to build on the NASA work in control non-payload communications. So we used those two springboards to build our phase 1 effort around.
Right.
Again, we didn't want to boil the ocean. We wanted to take some foundational work that was ready to go.
So I want to sort of riff off of the notion that we've been at this for 5 or 6 years that Paul mentioned, And contrasting that with the panel earlier today that was talking about speed and innovation, this is all happening quicker than anyone can keep up with. Steve, maybe you could sort of discuss that balance between the innovation and speed that the new entrant part of the community is looking for, and the process and the rigor that traditional aviation demands from its existing users.
Sure. So I think we heard once at a previous conference, faster alone, further together. That you might be able to build a radio, or you might be able to take a commercial offering and fly it in a limited circumstance, but then you would come to the point where you had not really encountered the national airspace system as it exists, as the largest and safest system that it is. So that one of the things that was extremely useful in 228 was getting a consensus from industry about what we could build, specifically the C2 link. And then we had to learn that, for example, there were other agencies using L-band that we had not known about. So we had to learn about that and profit from that. And then I think the next step is when we were in 228, you weren't just talking to aircraft cert. You weren't just talking to a radio guy. That you had air traffic in there. You had flight standards in there. You had all of the necessary entities to say, this is what we're looking for. This is the next step. You're not showing up at the aircraft certification office with just the aircraft part of the equation. And I think the other commitment we had made was that we made an effort in each of the plenaries to tell the group where this was going in a regulatory sense. So there's no guarantee that any of this is called out in regulation until we actually see how it works, we see how it interoperates, we see how all that works. But you have this significant thrust from industry so that we can write the advisory circular, we can write the technical standard order right directly from the MOPS. And so I think there was, I've worked RTCA over 25 years now, more than one project. And I think this, we never missed a scheduled deliverable. We dropped it on the morning it was due, as John Moore would remind us at the end of every meeting. And I think that was what we're trying to do with UAS, is industry comes together to the ACO, and we have something we can present, and then we have a niche into the regulatory structure, and then we go to the next step.
Excellent. Paul, in light of the National Academy report that you guys were talking about in the previous panel, do you want to comment at all on that balance and the way that the approach that 228 has taken in striking it?
Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned, if you sat through the last panel, the discussion revolved around risk assessment, performance-based standards applied to the certification of the vehicle, the system, and using them for the operational approval aspects of it. Clearly, the kind of work that RTCA does in developing performance-based industry consensus standards plays a major part, or will play a major part in that whole overall risk assessment process. If you look at the standards, they are not particularly prescriptive. They're relatively, I won't say general, but they do provide latitude. We're not advocating, the very specifics on how you build a piece of hardware. We are basically defining how something should perform. And you've got a lot of latitude in terms of what you build to be in compliance with those operational performance standards that the group is coming up with. And that is essentially the kind of the main central message from the National Academy's report, that we apply this stuff intelligently, appropriately to the entire certification process, and ultimately the approval from a risk assessment standpoint.
So one more reference, it goes back to Steve's starting point and then continues to build. It's all about safety, okay? We're talking about integrating an airspace. But we had to do something a little different in this approach because we didn't have the interoperability requirement, okay? Every ground station talking to a flying platform could be unique to another vendor's solution. So instead of being totally interoperable, we had to be compatible. And that created some differences in how we approached the problem. So we were learning a little bit as we went along in that context. So it is different in that regard. But again, we met the timing hurdles. We were dealing with a safety reference system. We weren't dealing with Part 107 elements, okay? We were dealing with where the airspace truly is integrated.
Andy, I was going to mention, by the way, in case any questions come in while we're talking, just signal me and we'll. Okay. Okay. I'm curious for the audience, what are some of the major hurdles that the committee is encountering in developing developing the Phase 1 MOPS that have been published and is encountering now as we broaden the scope into Phase 2? Yeah, anyone can take it.
Are you asking? Well, one that comes to mind is the discussion about SATCOM. In our terms of reference, there's a specific call out for developing a MOPS for a SATCOM, KAKU solution for command and control. It's there. It's in the terms of reference. The problem that we have come up with, and this was really rightly brought up by the new working group 2 chair, Jim Williams, that no one has really raised their hand and said that SATCOM was a priority. Consequently, there honestly has not been a lot of effort put into developing the framework or the actual MOPS for SATCOM. This issue came up at the last face-to-face meeting that we had a couple months back. We have since had one of the significant players step up and indicate that they felt that SATCOM was an important issue, and they graciously volunteered to take it on. So they will do that. We'll continue to press to make sure that we stay on schedule for the delivery of the entire MOPS documents in 2020, which will include the SATCOM piece, which I think the schedule called for that to be published September of 2019. But we got to get on with it. It is a complex issue. There are SATCOM systems out there in use primarily by DoD interests. There's no expectation on the part of any of us on 228 that should a MOPS come up for SATCOM, that there'd be an expectation that these existing companies with their existing platforms would have to modify anything significantly or at all. That obviously was a concern, but in terms of issues, that was probably the one that sticks out in my head most. We've had others. I'll turn this over to Rick. Relative to L-band and the C-band debate. If you can do that quickly before we all get too old.
Time over. Well, just as a comment, and again, this ties many things that we've heard together today. The reason we were dealing with SATCOM specifically was ICAO was looking for some guidance, and they turned it over to the technical community, and basically we stepped up to help answer that question. I think they were looking at it more at a MASPS level than a MOPS level, but since that time, we've recognized the more detailed work that's necessary.
Yeah, one of the things that strikes me as well is operational validation of the standards. I think in the sort of traditional aviation community, where you have these big operators, even though the absolute resources that it takes to validate some of these standards is pretty high, compared to running an airline, it's actually pretty small. And so you have several operators that can step in and big OEMs that can step in to validate standards. That I've seen that as a challenge in our community. Okay, it sounds like we've got. Oh, go ahead, Steve. Yeah.
Just one other point. I think we need to remember that we've made it more architecturally complex, right? The pilot's on the ground, some element of the control station is on the ground, so that the link connecting the pilot to the aircraft is more critical than it was before. I mean, before you have well-known NORDO procedures. You know, you can lose the radio link and you still have a process where if you lose the C2 link, you're in an air traffic emergency. And so we spent a long time, and I want to credit NASA. NASA put in a tremendous amount of actual flight time flying this radio. So it was very much our model doesn't do this. Why don't you go out and fly it and see what the model would have said? So it was very much validated all the way up and down. And I think I think we also found how challenging C-band was in terms of sighting ground stations and other things that aircraft cert traditionally doesn't get involved with. But it was a real good problem. So.
Okay. Yeah.
Can you? Okay, thanks. So I'm actually going to combine two questions because I think they dovetail each other really well. So the comments being made that performance standards are great to talk about in the abstract, but in practice they're harder to write than prescriptive standards. Okay, so then how do you balance the desire for performance-based requirements versus the schedule and cost advantage of prescriptive requirements? So just take that as a broad principle, broad question. So then, why don't you apply the answer to how you address cybersecurity issues?
Does anyone want to take that on?
Nope.
I will say from the side of that question related to performance versus prescriptive standards, writing performance-based standards I have experienced over the last 5 years is actually really hard. It's really difficult to write, to understand something well enough that you can bound the performance of it and still guarantee interoperability and compatibility. Certainly the detect and avoid working group struggled with that a lot.
Well, and I think quite frankly in the prescriptive nature and the performance-based nature, I mean, we're trying to stimulate innovation. And I think when we stay in the performance environment as opposed to the prescriptive environment, we are in fact stimulating that innovation. I think we have to look at the next step of innovation now is how do we make these links as secure as possible without consuming that very limited bandwidth with a whole host of protection that, I mean, we need to do something, absolutely, admittedly, but we don't want to overburden that precious link with something inappropriate. So we're looking for some innovation there as well. So the performance base gives us that flexibility. We already talked a bit about we don't have interoperability. We have a compatibility structure. So again, performance-based allows us to do that. Whereas had we been prescriptive, interoperability would have been one of the drivers.
You know, those of us who've been involved in rulemaking, and a lot of people in this room probably have had their hands in it, that's not an easy process. You know, it can take decades to generate a prescriptive rule or a new requirement to to certify an aircraft in a kind of a rule-based approach. So the idea of using performance-based, risk-based kinds of certification in this era where we really don't have a rule set that we can all gravitate around and build to seems to be a logical and appropriate step, and it will work. We still have, there's a few fleas on the dog yet, but I think we'll get where we need to be.
I'll also add on the performance-based question, one of the things that the detect and avoid standards did, which I think we all found, at least from an industry perspective, extremely useful and helpful, was that we actually provided an example implementation that met the performance requirements. So, we set the boundaries on what performance ought to be, but then provided some, cookie crumbs along the way to help developers either copy and paste things over if that was the right solution for them, or at least build off of something that was already there and validated.
So one of the things that we recognized as we went forward, and it was evidenced with the kind of documents we produced. We were producing 1,000-page documents, is we didn't have some of the core material that we normally have when we start an activity. I mean, if you look at the specific RTCA process, I mean, if you look at starting points and so on, typically you start from having a concept of operation. In many cases, in this case specifically, we didn't have that defined document up front. So there are appendices in these documents that set those assumptions, those operational elements that then we built the system design around. So we had to create that on the fly, again, meeting the schedule, but that also added to the complexity of the document, the complexity of the structure, and so on. So, the teams that put these documents together were comprehensive in their vision of how it all came together.
I think just to add to the previous question, when we talk about cybersecurity, we were very careful in phase one, and the UAS Integration Office was key in this, that they funded work on the threat analysis and the end-to-end security solution. And in terms of a question of scope, it's an appendix to the MOPS, and you can't put it in the TSO. The TSO is device specific, but it is in the advisory circular that concerns this. The advisory circular that's in legal right now does have that end-to-end security solution. So if you want something acceptable to the FAA in phase one, it's already there.
Yeah, and I'll add, Steve mentioned earlier how one of the things that makes unmanned aircraft so difficult is just the complexity that the architecture adds into solutions. And I think that goes for the cybersecurity question as well. We all recognize that cybersecurity is an issue for manned aviation. Maybe it's been put off for a long time, but it certainly gets even more complicated and even more critical when we look at unmanned aircraft. Same thing for navigation, just gets more complicated when you separate the pilot from the aircraft. And same thing with voice communication, now that we've separated the pilot that's talking from where the signal might actually be entering space. So there's a number of topics that go along with cybersecurity that the community needs to address. And to me, it points to the fact that unmanned aircraft need to be included in all of these discussions going forward. It's not like we can sit in SC-228 and solve all these problems for unmanned aircraft. Unmanned aircraft need to be part of the considerations for everything going forward.
Well, I think that's what we're talking about here today, is the airspace integration of all the users, and this just becomes another user that has to deal with the same set of issues.
Just one last comment, and again, it kind of piggybacks on something Rick said, was, part of this process in phase two was to develop a very robust OSED document, an environmental description of where we're going to be operating, a number of scenarios that the DAA solutions, the C2 solutions would serve. Ted Lester and his group did an outstanding job of putting that OSED document together. If you have a chance to read that, it does a really good job of kind of clarifying where all of this is going, and where the standards would be applied, and why they'd be applied, and it really becomes the guidepost for a lot of this stuff going forward.
Yep.
Since I have the microphone in my hand, can Andy ask a question or two?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, so two questions that come to mind, and these are really, they may be softballs and really macro, but the first one is there work in 228 that could help guide the light drone issues? And then second, and this is a incredibly potentially controversial issue, is how or if the principles that you're working on would ever start to apply to, I'll just say commercial aircraft. I mean, the House bill, the FAA bill had, I think it was a study on a single pilot, commercial type operation. And I'm just wondering, what the thoughts are about those two. I know those are meaty.
Okay, so Andy, you raise a very interesting point, because there is work. NASA had initiated some work several years ago on single pilot operations, and I think the first thing that came out of that is how do you deal with an incapacitated pilot in a single pilot operation? The platform becomes unmanned. Okay. The other thing that's going on at this point, as we look at a whole host of initiatives somewhat outside the scope of 228, but they create the culture that we're working with, the whole urban mobility question, and moving people, and dealing with things that are outside the small UAS boundary, but maybe below a certain altitude of operation or whatever. It's forcing us to look at more automated platforms, the introductory to autonomous operations at some point in time. Those principles then apply back to that single pilot, incapacitated pilot kind of regime. We already, EuroK is working standards for more automated, autonomous operations, and we're seeing elements of it even in our work. Return to track. You have a TCAS-like resolution advisory where you've taken action to move two aircraft apart. In the systems that we're looking at now, the return to track will actually return to track as part of an automated process. So, we're already dealing with the tip of those icebergs. I don't know that we have full resolution. I think there's a lot of research that still needs to go on in that regard. But the other side is we already have a continuum description from an airworthiness perspective, from the small unmanned aircraft all the way up through the largest air transport category aircraft. We have a risk class definition going from risk class 1 to 6. So we already are starting down the path of recognizing that degree of airworthy integration, putting the commercial aircraft on a similar risk-based approach, and so on. Are we there for the Airbus and the Boeing, commercial air transport category aircraft? Not yet, but we're having the conversations.
Andy, it's interesting. I mean, in my new role, I'm getting to talk to a lot more people who are a heck of a lot smarter than I am. And when we talk about performance-based, risk-based approaches to certification, there is some trepidation about going too far, particularly when you put a pink body in an aircraft that is, quote, unpiloted, someone at the controls sitting at the pointy end of that vehicle, that maybe strictly using performance or risk-based criteria to certify that vehicle without any level of prescriptiveness, if that's a word, may not be the way it goes. So I think, as Rick said, there's still a lot of work to be done find out what the right balance is, the right level of specificity in terms of the requirements to get where we ultimately want to go to the larger optionally piloted or optionally manned vehicles down the road.
On your first question about how the way I would rephrase it is what could the small UAS community sort of learn from the experience of the larger systems that have been considered within Special Committee 228. And I would link that back to the OSED topic and actually defining the operations in a very sort of well-documented, rigorous way. Because I think once that process of doing that, of creating the OSED, at least within SC 228, forced us to reconcile and come to terms with some of the great ideas that were not practical, and some of the really interesting operations that people wanted to do that really are not compatible with the way that the airspace is designed and the way that commercial operations happen today. And that sort of took us from the boil of the ocean to, okay, now we actually have a set of operations that we can build standard equipment around. I haven't seen that from the small UAS community yet. Not to say it doesn't exist, but certainly not as well documented as we've done in our OSED.
But I think you might also flip that around, because historically I think we took military technologies and sized them appropriately and put them into the commercial operations. I think there's a paradigm shift that's going to say we're going to learn by the small unmanned aircraft. We're going to benefit from them and how we redeploy technologies and capabilities in higher end platforms. And the biggest example I've got is look at the sensor market. LiDAR, cost of LiDAR sensors, cost of other sensors that were prohibitive in the past are becoming, from the auto market, from the small UAS marketplace, are becoming $1, $2, $3 sensors that we have to look at what the implications are now to make them more cost effective for systems that we can use in the traditional markets.
Yeah, electronic flight bags are another great example of that. With the remaining time we have, I was wondering if any of you would like to touch on the contribution that NASA made to the Phase 1 work. We mentioned it a little bit here and there, but it's certainly worth articulating again.
Yeah, sure. I think what's important is they were, they were founding members, and so we had work on the reference implementation. So it was both Collins and NASA were really the backbone use case. And as I mentioned, we had extensive flight time from Glenn, and the international spectrum work. There was help from NASA there. They also provided some of the key SMEs on the security work. So it's all through there. And then when the heavy lifting of actually putting the test cases came through, a lot of that was Glenn and the FAA Tech Center. It was just the traditional heavyweights, stepped right up. So it was very nice to see the finish of Phase 1.
Yeah, and certainly on the detect and avoid side, from a human factors perspective, NASA provided the majority of the human factors experimentation and data collection activities that went into developing the displays that ultimately are going to go in the control station for detect and avoid. And we showed the picture earlier about the flight test activities. There was actually 2 entire summer flight test campaigns on the detect and avoid side, leveraging NASA's Icana and a number of other aircraft in the NASA fleet. So tremendous amount of jet fuel burned over those 5 years. Okay, with that, I think we'll go ahead and wrap it up. And thank you to the panelists for being here.
Yeah, and thank you for the amazing work that you are representing with what 228 has done. It's really quite incredible. So thank you very much.